Rain hammered the empty street with a violence that made the city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. Inside a black car moving slowly through the flooded road, Dante Marchetti sat with his eyes fixed on his phone, reading a message that had ruined his entire night. A shipment had been delayed. A partner had gone silent. And somewhere in the chaos of numbers and names, his mind kept drifting to something he could not explain, a heaviness in his chest that refused to leave. The car slowed at a red light. Dante glanced up out of habit, the way a man trained to notice everything always does, and something at the corner of his vision made him go still. At the bus stop across the street, soaked through her thin gray coat, a woman sat curled on the narrow metal bench. Her head rested against the plastic wall of the shelter, her arms wrapped around a leather folder as if it were the only warm thing left in the world. Rain dripped from her hair onto her cheeks, but she did not move. She was asleep, completely unaware of the storm around her. Dante recognized her immediately. Elena Voss, his secretary of 2 years, the woman who organized his calendar, answered his calls, and stayed silent through every terrifying conversation that passed through his office walls. He should have looked away. He should have let the light change and let the car drive on, the way he had done 1,000 times before with people who were not his concern. That was the rule he had lived by since he was a young man clawing his way into power. Never let weakness distract you. Never let softness slow you down. But he did not look away. "Stop the car," Dante said quietly. His driver, Nico, turned in surprise. "Sir." "I said stop." Nico pulled the car to the curb without another word. He had worked for Dante long enough to know that when his boss's voice dropped to that low, flat tone, questions were not welcome. Dante stepped out into the rain without an umbrella. The water soaked through his tailored jacket within seconds, but he barely noticed. He crossed the street with slow, deliberate steps, the same steps he took when walking into a room full of enemies, except this time there was no danger waiting for him. Only a woman who had fallen asleep from exhaustion in the middle of a storm. He stopped in front of the bench and looked down at her. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremble in her fingers even in sleep, the way her lips were pale from the cold. The folder in her arms was open just enough for him to see his own name printed across the top page. Marchetti Holdings, quarterly report. She had been working. Even here, even now, she had been working. "Elena," he said, his voice low. She did not stir. He tried again, louder this time. "Elena." Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she stared at him with the confused, unguarded look of someone pulled suddenly from a deep sleep. Then recognition crashed into her expression, followed immediately by panic. She sat up so fast that the folder slipped from her lap and fell onto the wet pavement. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, scrambling to gather the scattered papers before the rain ruined them completely. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to fall asleep here. I was waiting for the next bus and I must have." "Stop," Dante said, not unkindly. She froze, papers clutched to her chest, rain running down her face, waiting for whatever punishment she believed was coming. In her mind, she had already begun composing an apology email, already imagining the conversation where he told her that professionalism mattered, that a secretary sleeping in public reflected poorly on the company, that perhaps she needed to reconsider her position. Instead, Dante crouched down slightly so that his eyes were level with hers. "Why are you out here? Where is your car?" "I do not have a car," Elena said quietly, embarrassment coloring her cheeks despite the cold. "I take the bus, but I missed the last one an hour ago because I was finishing the report you needed for tomorrow's meeting." Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had asked for that report at the end of the day, a casual request tossed out as he walked past her desk on his way to a late meeting. He had not thought about what it meant for her to stay behind, to finish the work alone in an empty office, to walk out into a storm with no way home. "How long have you been sitting here?" I am not sure, maybe 2 hours. The buses have been delayed because of the flooding on 5th Street. 2 hours. Dante looked at her again, really looked at her, and saw not just his secretary but a person who had been quietly suffering in the cold while he sat in his warm car scrolling through messages about missing shipments that, in this moment, felt entirely unimportant. "Get up," he said, extending his hand. Alina hesitated. In 2 years of working for him, Dante Marchetti had never once touched her hand, never once crouched down to speak to her at eye level, never once shown any concern for her personal circumstances. He was a man defined by distance, by control, by the careful walls he built around every interaction. This moment, right now, did not fit anything she understood about him. "Mr. Marchetti, truly, I can wait for the bus. You do not need to trouble yourself." "Alina," he said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply, "get in the car." There was no anger in his tone, but there was no room for argument either. She took his hand, and he pulled her gently to her feet. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long in the cold, and she stumbled slightly. Without thinking, Dante steadied her by the shoulder, his grip firm but careful, as though she were something fragile that had been left out in the storm too long. They crossed the street together, Alina clutching her damp folder, Dante walking half a step behind her as if guarding her from something unseen. Nico held the door open, his face carefully neutral, though his eyes flicked toward Dante with silent questions he knew better than to ask aloud. Inside the car, the warmth hit Alina like a physical force. She began to shiver uncontrollably now that her body realized how cold it truly was. Dante reached forward without a word and adjusted the heat, then took the jacket from his own shoulders, the one that was still damp but far warmer than her thin coat, and placed it over her shoulders. "You do not have to," she started. "I know," Dante interrupted. "Wear it anyway." Alina fell silent, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. It smelled faintly of rain and something else, a clean, sharp scent that she could not quite place. She stared out the window as the city passed by in blurred lights, too stunned by the strangeness of the situation to speak. Dante sat across from her, his eyes occasionally drifting to her reflection in the window. He was a man who had built an empire through calculation, through reading people before they even understood themselves, and yet in this moment he could not calculate what he was feeling. There was something about the sight of her curled up alone in the rain that had cracked something open in him, something he had spent years keeping sealed shut. "Where do you live?" he asked. She gave him the address, her voice small, still unsure if this was truly happening, or if exhaustion had finally caused her mind to imagine things. The drive was quiet. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who are both trying to understand something new, something neither of them had words for yet. When the car finally stopped outside a modest apartment building, Alina moved to hand back the jacket, but Dante shook his head. "Keep it, return it tomorrow if you insist." "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For this, you did not have to." "No," Dante agreed, "I did not." He did not explain further, and she did not ask him to. She stepped out of the car, glanced back once to see him watching her through the rain-streaked window, and then disappeared into the building. As the car pulled away, Nico glanced at his boss through the rearview mirror. "Sir, if I may ask?" "You may not," Dante said, but there was no real edge to his voice. He turned to look out the window at the storm still raging outside, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his mind was not on business, not on threats, not on the endless calculations of power. It was on the image of a woman asleep in the rain, clutching his work to her chest as though it mattered more than her own comfort. He thought about the countless people who worked for him, the countless faces that passed through his organization without ever truly being seen. He had built his life around not seeing them, around treating loyalty as a transaction and softness as a liability. But something about tonight had shifted that foundation, even if only slightly, even if he was not yet ready to admit it to himself. Back in her apartment, Alina sat on the edge of her bed, still wrapped in Dante's jacket, staring at the wall without really seeing it. Her heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold she had just escaped. She kept replaying the moment he crouched down to her level, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the careful way he had steadied her when she stumbled. She told herself it meant nothing. He was her employer. Men like Dante Marchetti did not develop feelings for their secretaries. He had simply done what any decent person would do, nothing more. But even as she tried to convince herself of this, she could not shake the memory of his eyes, the intensity in them when he looked at her, as though he was seeing her for the very first time despite 2 years of working side by side. She changed out of her wet clothes, hung his jacket carefully over a chair so it could dry, and lay awake long after she should have fallen asleep, her mind circling the same unanswerable question. Why had he stopped the car? Why had he, of all people, cared enough to notice her at all? Across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline, Dante stood by the window with a glass of untouched liquor in his hand. Rain streaked down the glass in front of him, distorting the lights below into shapeless smears of color. He thought about his own childhood, about nights spent waiting for someone who never came, about the cold, empty feeling of being forgotten by the people who were supposed to protect him. He had built his entire life around never feeling that way again, around surrounding himself with power so absolute that vulnerability became impossible. And yet tonight, watching Alina sleep alone in the storm, he had felt something crack inside that carefully constructed armor. Not weakness, he told himself. Not exactly. Something else. Something he did not yet have a name for. He set the glass down without drinking from it and turned away from the window. Tomorrow, he would return to his desk, back to the endless demands of running an empire built on danger and control. But something had changed tonight. Some quiet shift that he could feel even if he could not explain it. And as he finally lay down to sleep, his last thought was not of business or threats or the missing shipment that had ruined his evening. It was of Alina, asleep in the rain, holding his work as though it were something worth protecting. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet, rain-soaked moment, that a single stop at a red light would set into motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the world Dante had spent his entire life building. Neither of them could have known that the walls he had built so carefully around his heart had just begun to crumble, one quiet act of kindness at a time. But somewhere, in another part of the city, other eyes were already watching, other ears were already listening, and the quiet moment between a powerful man and his secretary would not stay quiet for long. Morning arrived with a pale, washed-out light that filtered through the tall windows of Marchetti Holdings. Alina stood outside the glass doors of the executive floor, her hand hovering over the handle, her stomach twisted into knots that had nothing to do with hunger. She had barely slept, replaying the events of the previous night over and over until they blurred into something that felt almost unreal. Now, standing here in the cold light of day, she was certain of only one thing. She had to face him. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The office was already alive with quiet activity, assistants moving between desks, phones ringing in distant rooms, the low hum of a business empire beginning its day. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to meet the curious glances of a few coworkers who had noticed her hesitation at the door. Her desk sat just outside Dante's office, a position of trust that she had earned through 2 years of flawless work. She set down her bag, smoothed her blazer, and forced herself to breathe normally. Perhaps he would say nothing about it. Perhaps last night would remain unspoken, tucked away as an isolated moment neither of them needed to acknowledge again. The door to his office opened before she could settle into her chair. "Alina," Dante said, "come in." Her heart dropped. This was it then. The conversation she had been dreading all night, the one where he explained, in careful and measured words, that what happened last night could not happen again, that perhaps it was best if she found a position elsewhere, one that did not require such demanding hours. She walked into his office, folder in hand out of habit even though there was no meeting scheduled, and stood in front of his desk with her chin lifted, determined not to show how nervous she felt. Dante was seated behind his desk, dressed in a dark suit that made him look every bit the powerful, controlled man the world knew him to be. There was no trace of the storm-soaked figure who had crouched beside her at the bus stop the night before. And yet, when his eyes met hers, something flickered there, something that told her he had not forgotten either. "Sit down," he said. She sat spine straight, hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, Dante said nothing. He studied her with the same careful attention he gave to contracts and business rivals, as though trying to read something written between the lines of her posture. Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, refusing to look away first. "Why didn't you call someone?" he finally asked. The question caught her off guard. It was not the question she had braced herself for. "What do you mean?" "Last night," Dante clarified, "when you missed the bus. Why didn't you call a friend, a neighbor, anyone, instead of sitting alone in the cold for 2 hours?" Elena hesitated, unsure how honest she should be with a man who held her entire livelihood in his hands. But something about the directness of his question, the genuine curiosity behind it, made her lower her guard slightly. "I do not have anyone to call," she admitted quietly. "My family lives far from here, and I have not had the chance to build many close friendships since I moved to this city for work. I did not want to bother a coworker so late at night over something so small." Sitting alone in a storm for 2 hours is not small. "It felt small compared to asking for help," Elena said. "I have always managed things on my own. I did not think it was a big enough problem to involve anyone else." Dante leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. Her answer had struck a chord in him that he had not expected, a quiet echo of his own childhood, of growing up in a house where asking for help was seen as weakness, where pride became the only shield against a world that offered little comfort. He remembered being a boy of 10, sitting on the steps of an apartment building in the rain, waiting for a mother who came home hours later than promised, too tired and too broken by her own struggles to notice her son had been waiting outside in the cold. He remembered deciding in that moment that he would never again depend on anyone, that he would build a life where he needed no one, where vulnerability had no place. Elena's words, spoken so simply, so honestly, had reached into that buried memory and pulled it into the light. "That will not happen again," Dante said finally. Elena blinked. "Sir. From now on, if you are working late, you will not take the bus home. I will arrange a car for you." "That is not necessary, truly. I do not want to be a burden." "It is not a request, Elena." His voice was firm, though not unkind. "You work hard for this company. The least I can do is ensure you get home safely." Elena did not know how to respond. In 2 years, Dante Marchetti had never once made an accommodation for her personal comfort. He was known throughout the company, throughout the entire city, as a man who valued results above all else, who rewarded competence but rarely showed warmth. This sudden shift felt disorienting, as though the ground beneath her had tilted slightly without warning. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I appreciate that." Dante nodded once, a clear signal that the conversation was over, and Elena rose to leave. But just as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Elena." She turned back. "You do not have to handle everything alone," he said quietly. "Not anymore." The words settled over her like something warm and unfamiliar, and she left his office with her mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them, something she could not yet name but could feel with absolute certainty. News of small changes travels quickly in a place built on careful observation, and Dante's office was no exception. Within days, his assistants and senior staff noticed subtle differences in his behavior. He asked Alina to leave the office by a reasonable hour, something he had never concerned himself with before. He assigned her a company car, insisting the driver wait for her each evening regardless of when she finished her work. He began checking, almost casually, that she had eaten lunch, that she was not overextending herself with unnecessary tasks. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but together they painted a picture that unsettled the people who had worked closely with Dante Marchetti for years. This was not the man they knew. The Dante they knew did not notice small details about his employees' well-being. He noticed profit margins, loyalty, threats, and opportunities. He did not notice whether his secretary had eaten lunch. Marco Bellini, Dante's longtime consigliere, and one of the few people who had earned his complete trust, was the first to voice what others were only whispering. "You have been different lately," Marco said one evening, standing in Dante's office with a glass of whiskey in hand, the city lights glittering behind him through the tall windows. "Different how?" Dante asked without looking up from the documents on his desk. "You know how," Marco said. "Ever since that night in the rain, you have been paying attention to things you never used to care about. People are starting to notice, Dante. And in our world, when people notice a shift in the boss's behavior, they start asking questions. They start looking for weaknesses." Dante finally looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "I am simply making sure my staff is taken care of. That is good business." "Is that what this is?" Marco asked, his tone skeptical but not unkind. He had known Dante since they were young men building their empire from nothing, and he could see through the careful mask his old friend wore with practiced ease. "Because it looks like something else to me." "Whatever it looks like," Dante said, his voice hardening slightly, "it is not your concern." Marco held up his hands in surrender, though his eyes remained watchful. "I am not trying to overstep. I am trying to protect you. You know how this world works. Softness is seen as an opening. If people believe you have grown attached to someone, they will use it against you. They will use her against you." The words hung heavily in the room. Dante's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, silence stretched between the two men. "No one will touch her," Dante said finally, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight. Marco studied his friend carefully, searching for the calculated businessman he had known for years. Instead, he saw something new, something fiercely protective that had not existed before, and it worried him more than any business threat ever could. "Just be careful," Marco said finally. "That is all I ask." After Marco left, Dante sat alone in his office, staring out at the city lights without really seeing them. He knew Marco was right to be concerned. In their world, attachment was a liability, a crack in the armor that enemies would not hesitate to exploit. He had spent years building an image of untouchable control, and he understood exactly what it meant to let that image slip, even slightly. And yet, when he thought of Alina, of the quiet strength in her voice when she admitted she had no one to call, of the way she carried herself with dignity despite years of managing everything alone, he could not bring himself to regret the choices he had made. Something about her presence in his life, however small the changes had been so far, felt like the first genuine thing he had allowed himself to feel in longer than he could remember. Meanwhile, word of the changes in Dante's behavior had begun to travel beyond the walls of his own organization. In the world of powerful men who watched each other constantly for signs of weakness, even small shifts did not stay contained for long. Rumors moved through private conversations, through carefully worded messages between associates, through the kind of gossip that thrived in circles where information was currency. Salvatore Conti, a rival boss who had spent years trying to find a foothold against Dante's growing influence, heard the rumors through one of his own informants. He sat in his office, turning the information over in his mind with the careful interest of a man who understood that even the smallest weakness could become a powerful weapon. Marchetti has grown soft over a secretary, his informant reported. He has changed his routines for her. His own people are talking about it. Salvatore smiled slowly, an expression that held no warmth. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting. He had spent years watching Dante Marchetti build an empire that seemed impossible to crack, an organization built on discipline, control, and an almost inhuman ability to remain detached from anything that might compromise his position. If this rumor proved true, if Dante truly had allowed himself to care about someone in a way that made him vulnerable, then perhaps the crack Salvatore had been searching for had finally appeared. Find out everything about her, Salvatore instructed. Where she lives, who she knows, what she means to him. If Marchetti has a weakness now, I intend to understand it completely before I decide how to use it. Back in his penthouse that evening, unaware of the storm quietly gathering on the horizon, Dante stood by his window once again, thinking of Elena, of the way she had looked at him that morning with cautious hope in her eyes. He did not yet know that his quiet acts of kindness had already drawn the attention of dangerous eyes, that the walls he had allowed to soften for her sake had created an opening that his enemies were already preparing to exploit. For now, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace, a small, private acknowledgement that something in his carefully controlled life had shifted for the better. He did not yet understand how quickly that peace would be tested, or how far he would be willing to go to protect the one person who had managed to reach the part of him he had believed was permanently closed off from the world. 2 weeks passed, and the quiet shift in Dante's behavior had settled into something resembling a routine. Elena no longer waited for buses in the rain. Every evening, a car waited for her outside the office, and though she had insisted at first that she did not need such treatment, she had come to accept it as one of the strange, unexplainable kindnesses that had entered her life since that stormy night. She had also begun to notice something else, something she tried not to dwell on too much. Dante had started walking past her desk more often, pausing to ask about her day, lingering slightly longer than necessary during their brief morning meetings. She told herself these were simply the actions of an employer who had developed a sense of responsibility toward his staff. She told herself this every single day, and every single day she found the explanation harder to believe. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Elena sat at her desk organizing files for an upcoming meeting when Grace Whitfield, one of the few co-workers she had grown close to over the years, approached with a look of barely contained curiosity. "All right," Grace said, perching on the edge of Elena's desk. "You have to tell me what is going on. Everyone is talking about it." "Talking about what?" Elena asked, though she had a feeling she already knew. "About him," Grace said, tilting her head toward Dante's closed office door. "About the car, the early evenings, the way he actually smiles now when he walks past your desk. Elena, the man used to walk through this office like nobody else existed. Now he notices everything about you." Elena felt her cheeks warm and busied herself with the files in front of her. "He is simply making sure the office runs smoothly. That is all." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Sure, that is definitely what is happening here." "Grace, I am just saying," Grace continued, lowering her voice slightly, "be careful. A man like that, in a world like his, does not change his habits for nothing. Whatever this is, it is not small, and it might not be as simple as you want it to be." Elena did not respond, though Grace's words settled uncomfortably in her mind. She knew, on some level, that something had shifted, that whatever existed between her and Dante had grown into something neither of them had openly acknowledged. But acknowledging it meant confronting a reality that felt both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. That evening, as she prepared to leave the office, Dante appeared at her desk, something he rarely did so late in the day. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. "Of course," Elena said, setting down her bag. He gestured toward his office, and she followed him inside, curious about what could require a private conversation at this hour. Once the door closed behind them, Dante turned to face her, his expression more serious than usual. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly," he said. Elena nodded, her heart beginning to race. "Are you comfortable with the changes I have made? The car, the earlier hours, all of it. I do not want you to feel obligated to accept these things simply because I am your employer." The question surprised her with its vulnerability. This was not the tone of a powerful businessman issuing directives. This was something quieter, more uncertain, almost hesitant. "I am comfortable," Elena said honestly, "more than comfortable actually. No one has ever looked out for me the way you have these past 2 weeks. I do not fully understand why, but I am grateful for it." Dante studied her for a long moment, and Elena could see something shifting behind his eyes, some internal decision being made. "That night in the rain," he said slowly, "it reminded me of something I had buried for a long time. Watching you there, alone, exhausted, still holding on to work that belonged to me as though it mattered more than your own comfort, it made me realize how easily people can disappear into the background of someone else's life. I did not want you to disappear into the background of mine." Elena's breath caught. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not this. "I do not know what this is," Dante continued, his voice quieter now, more honest than she had ever heard it. "I have spent years building walls around myself, convincing myself that caring about anyone was a weakness I could not afford. But somehow, without meaning to, you have made those walls feel less necessary." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The office around them felt smaller, quieter, as though the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them and the weight of everything unspoken between them. "I do not know what this means either," Elena finally said. "But I know that I have thought about that night more times than I can count. I know that these past 2 weeks have felt different in a way I cannot fully explain. And I know that whatever this is, I do not want it to disappear." Dante took a step closer, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Neither do I." The moment stretched between them, fragile and uncertain, filled with the kind of tension that comes from two people standing at the edge of something neither fully understands, but both feel pulled toward. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance, though the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken possibility. Finally, Dante stepped back, clearing his throat slightly, as though pulling himself back from the edge of something he was not yet ready to fall into completely. "It is late. You should go home." Elena nodded, though a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. "Good night, Dante." It was the first time she had used his first name, and the sound of it seemed to catch him off guard, though he recovered quickly, a faint smile of his own appearing. "Good night, Elena." She left his office with her mind spinning, the conversation replaying over and over as she made her way to the car waiting outside. Something had shifted between them tonight, something neither of them had fully named, but something that felt undeniably real. What neither of them knew, as they each returned to their separate homes that evening, was that their quiet moment of honesty had been witnessed by eyes that did not belong to them. A member of Salvatore Conti's network, planted within the building under the guise of a maintenance worker, had been watching the office for days, gathering information, waiting for the right moment to report back to his employer. The information he had gathered tonight was more valuable than anything he could have hoped for. Dante Marchetti, the untouchable boss of one of the most powerful organizations in the city, had developed feelings for his secretary. And feelings, as Salvatore Conti understood better than most, were the most effective weapon of all. The following morning, Salvatore sat in his private office, listening intently as his informant relayed everything he had observed. When the report finished, Salvatore leaned back in his chair, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. "So it is true," he said quietly. "Marchetti has finally shown me his weakness." "What do you want to do?" his informant asked. "For now, nothing," Salvatore said. "We watch. We learn everything about her, her routines, her habits, the people she trusts. When the time is right, we will not need force to bring Dante Marchetti to his knees. We will simply need to remind him what it feels like to lose something he cannot afford to lose." Unaware of the danger quietly closing in around her, Alina spent the following days floating through a strange, quiet happiness she had not felt in years. The careful distance that had once defined her relationship with Dante had softened into something warmer, something that made even the most mundane tasks feel lighter. They had not spoken openly again about what existed between them, but the unspoken understanding lingered in every glance, every small gesture, every quiet moment they shared throughout their busy days. Dante, too, found himself experiencing a strange, unfamiliar sense of contentment. For years, his life had revolved entirely around control, strategy, and the constant management of threats both real and potential. But in the quiet moments he now shared with Alina, brief conversations over coffee, small kindnesses exchanged without explanation, he found himself experiencing something he had convinced himself he no longer had access to. A sense of genuine connection, uncomplicated by ambition or calculation. He did not yet know how quickly that fragile peace would be tested, or how far Salvatore Conti was already prepared to go to exploit the very thing that had finally made Dante Marchetti feel human again. As the days passed, small signs began to emerge that something was not right. Alina noticed a car parked outside her apartment building on several evenings, always empty, always gone by morning. She dismissed it initially as coincidence, but the unease lingered, a quiet whisper of instinct she could not fully ignore. Dante, ever perceptive, noticed subtle shifts in the patterns of his own security, small inconsistencies that suggested someone was watching more closely than usual. He said nothing to Alina at first, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace they had built, but internally, he began quietly increasing precautions, unwilling to take any chances with her safety. Neither of them spoke openly about the growing sense of unease settling over their new, tentative connection, but both of them felt it, a quiet tension building beneath the surface of their days, a storm gathering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to break. And somewhere across the city, in the shadowed offices of a rival empire, Salvatore Conti continued to watch, continued to wait, continued to plan the exact moment when he would finally strike at the one vulnerability Dante Marchetti had never intended to reveal. The message arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered not through the usual channels of business communication, but through a single envelope left on Dante's desk without explanation. No one on his staff could say how it had gotten there. No one admitted to letting anyone unfamiliar into the building. Dante opened it alone, his expression unreadable as he read the contents. Inside was a single photograph. Alina, walking from her apartment building to the waiting car, unaware that she was being watched. Beneath the photograph, a short message written in careful, deliberate handwriting. "Everyone has something they cannot afford to lose. I suggest we discuss terms before I decide what to do with mine." There was no signature, but Dante did not need one. Only one man in the city would dare send such a message, would dare threaten something so personal with such calculated confidence. Salvatore Conti had finally made his move, and he had chosen the one target Dante had never prepared himself to defend. Dante sat in silence for a long moment, the photograph resting on his desk, his mind working through the implications with the same cold precision he applied to every threat that had ever crossed his path. But this was different. This was not a business rival threatening territory or profit. This was a direct threat against Alina, against the one person who had managed to breach the walls he had spent his entire life constructing. He called Marco into his office immediately. "Conti knows about her," Dante said, sliding the photograph across the desk without preamble. Marco's expression darkened as he studied the image. "How long has he been watching her?" "I do not know. Long enough to gather this. Long enough to feel confident sending a message like this without fear of consequences." "What do you want to do?" Dante's eyes were cold, calculating, the warmth that had softened his expression over the past few weeks replaced entirely by something sharper, more dangerous. "I want to make sure Salvatore Conti understands, without question, that this was the worst decision he has ever made." Marco studied his old friend carefully. He had seen Dante angry before, had seen him make ruthless decisions in the pursuit of power and territory. But this was different. This was not calculated ambition. This was something far more personal, something that burned with an intensity Marco had never witnessed in all their years working together. "Careful, Dante," Marco warned. "This is exactly what he wants. He wants you to react emotionally, to make mistakes that expose you further. If you move against him without a clear strategy, you will only confirm what he already suspects, that she has become your weakness." Dante's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to consider Marco's words. His old friend was right, as much as the fury coursing through him wanted to dismiss caution entirely. Acting recklessly would only strengthen Salvatore's position, would only prove that the threat had struck exactly where intended. "Then we will not move recklessly," Dante said finally, his voice regaining its familiar, controlled edge. "But we will move decisively. I want every resource Conti relies on cut off, quietly, methodically, until he understands that threatening what belongs to me carries consequences he cannot survive." Over the following days, Dante's organization moved with the quiet, calculated precision that had built his empire in the first place. Supply routes that had once flowed smoothly toward Conti's territory began experiencing unexplained delays. Business partnerships that Salvatore had relied upon for years suddenly grew hesitant, their loyalty quietly redirected through careful negotiations conducted far from public attention. Nothing was done through violence or open confrontation. Everything was done through strategy, through influence, through the slow and deliberate dismantling of every advantage Salvatore Conti had built for himself. At the same time, Dante ensured that Alina's safety became an absolute priority, though he was careful not to alarm her unnecessarily. Additional security began accompanying her without her fully realizing the extent of the precautions being taken. Her daily routine was subtly monitored, every potential vulnerability addressed before it could be exploited. Alina, sensing that something had changed in the atmosphere around her, finally confronted Dante directly one evening after most of the office had emptied for the day. "Something is wrong," she said, standing in the doorway of his office, her arms crossed. "I am not foolish, Dante. I have noticed the additional security, the way your driver watches the street more carefully now, the tension in your voice during our conversations this week. Please, tell me what is happening." Dante studied her for a long moment, weighing how much honesty she deserved against how much protection she needed. Finally, he gestured for her to sit, and once she had settled into the chair across from his desk, he told her everything. The photograph, the message, the rival boss who had turned his growing feelings for her into a weapon aimed directly at his greatest weakness. Alina listened in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm to something quieter, more resolute, as the full picture became clear. "This is my fault," she said finally. "No," Dante said firmly. "This is not your fault. This is the consequence of a world I chose to build long before you were ever part of it. You did nothing wrong, Alina. You simply existed, and that was enough for someone like Conti to see an opportunity. But I am putting you in danger. I am giving your enemies a way to hurt you. You are not putting me in danger, Dante said, his voice softening. You are the first thing in years that has made me remember what it means to have something worth protecting. I will not allow Conti or anyone else to take that away from me. Elena felt tears gathering, though she fought to keep them from falling. The weight of everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the strange and overwhelming realization that she had become the center of a conflict between two of the most powerful men in the city, threatened to overwhelm her entirely. I am scared, she admitted quietly. Dante rose from his desk and moved to sit beside her instead, close enough that she could feel the steady warmth of his presence. I know, but I promise you, Elena, nothing will happen to you. I will handle this completely before it ever reaches a point where you are in real danger. How can you be so certain? Because I have spent my entire life building the kind of power that makes certainty possible, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. And for the first time, I finally understand exactly what that power is for. The following week, tensions between the two organizations reached a quiet, dangerous peak. Salvatore, sensing that his carefully planned advantage was slipping away as his resources continued to dwindle, grew increasingly desperate. He requested a private meeting with Dante, a rare and significant gesture in a world where such requests were never made lightly. Dante agreed, though he made certain that every possible precaution was taken before stepping into a room with a man who had already proven himself willing to threaten innocent lives to gain an advantage. They met in a neutral location, a quiet restaurant closed for the evening, its usual patrons replaced entirely by carefully positioned security from both organizations. Salvatore sat across from Dante, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished by the steady losses his organization had suffered over the past week. You have made your point, Salvatore said, his tone carefully measured despite the tension evident beneath his words. I underestimated how far you would go to protect her. You underestimated many things, Dante replied evenly, including how quickly I could dismantle everything you have spent years building. What do you want, Marchetti? An apology, a truce? I want you to understand, completely and without question, that Elena Voss is not a weakness you can exploit. She is not leverage. She is not a bargaining chip in whatever game you believe we are playing. If you or anyone connected to you ever comes near her again, the consequences will extend far beyond supply routes and business partnerships. Salvatore studied Dante carefully, searching for any sign of exaggeration in his words and finding none. The man sitting across from him was not simply protecting his territory or his reputation. He was protecting something far more personal, something that burned with an intensity Salvatore had never anticipated when he first heard rumors of Dante's softened behavior. Understood, Salvatore said finally, his voice quieter now, carrying the weight of a man who recognized when he had been thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. This matter is closed. See that it stays closed, Dante warned, rising from the table without another word. As he left the restaurant, Dante felt the tension that had gripped him for the past week finally begin to ease, though it did not disappear entirely. He understood better than most that men like Salvatore Conti rarely accepted defeat gracefully, that this quiet resolution might only be temporary. But for now, the immediate threat to Elena had been neutralized, and that was enough to allow him a moment of relief. When he returned to the office that evening, he found Elena waiting for him, having heard through careful, indirect channels that the confrontation had taken place. She rose from her chair the moment he entered, searching his expression for any sign of what had happened. It is done, Dante said simply. You are safe. Elena crossed the room without hesitation and wrapped her arms around him, a gesture neither of them had allowed themselves before, but one that felt entirely natural in this moment of quiet relief. Dante held her carefully, the weight of the past week's tension finally beginning to dissolve as he felt her steady presence against him. "Thank you," she whispered. "You never have to thank me for protecting what matters to me," Dante replied quietly. As they stood together in the quiet office, neither of them spoke of what this meant for the future, of the questions that still remained unanswered about what exactly existed between them. But something had solidified in that moment, something neither of them was willing to deny any longer. The underworld, watching from a careful distance, had witnessed something they had never expected from Dante Marchetti. Not weakness, as many had initially assumed, but a fierce, unwavering strength born from having finally found something worth fighting for beyond power, beyond territory, beyond the endless pursuit of control that had defined his life for so long. Word of the confrontation spread quietly through the careful channels of the underworld, and with it came a quiet recalibration of how Dante Marchetti was understood by those who had once believed his growing attachment to Alina represented an exploitable weakness. What they saw instead was a man willing to dismantle an entire rival organization without hesitation, without mercy, in defense of a single person he refused to lose. Weeks passed, and the quiet resolution between Dante and Salvatore held firm, though the memory of how close everything had come to falling apart lingered in the back of both their minds. For Alina, the experience had changed something fundamental in how she understood the man she worked for, and the man she had, somewhere along the way, allowed herself to fall in love with. She had learned things about him during the confrontation with Salvatore that she had never fully understood before, glimpses into a world of calculated danger and absolute control that existed far beyond the careful, professional environment of their daily office life. And yet, rather than pushing her away, this deeper understanding had only strengthened her determination to know him completely, not just the powerful businessman the world saw, but the guarded, complicated man who had chosen to protect her at tremendous personal cost. One evening, as the office emptied around them and the city outside began settling into the quiet rhythm of early night, Alina found herself standing in Dante's office once again, though this time the conversation she intended to have felt far more significant than any that had come before. "I need to understand something," she said, closing the door behind her. Dante looked up from his desk, setting aside the documents he had been reviewing. "What is it?" "Why me?" Alina asked, moving further into the room. "You have spent your entire life building walls around yourself, protecting yourself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. And yet, that night in the rain, you chose to stop the car. You chose to notice me. Why?" Dante rose from his desk slowly, considering his answer carefully before speaking. This was not a question he could answer with the calculated precision he applied to business decisions. This required a kind of honesty he had spent years avoiding entirely. "When I saw you that night," he began, "sitting alone in the rain, exhausted, holding onto my work as though it mattered more than your own well-being, it reminded me of something I had buried for a very long time. I grew up in circumstances that taught me love and safety were not things I could rely on. I learned to protect myself by refusing to need anyone, by convincing myself that control was the only thing that mattered." He paused, moving closer to where she stood, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "But watching you that night, I saw someone who had learned the same lesson I had, someone who had convinced herself that managing everything alone was preferable to risking disappointment. And something about recognizing that same wound in you made me realize how exhausting it is to carry that kind of loneliness. I did not want you to carry it any longer, not if I could help it." Alina felt her eyes fill with tears, though this time she did not try to stop them. "I have spent so many years telling myself the same thing, that needing people only leads to being let down, that it is safer to handle everything alone." "And now?" Dante asked quietly. "Now," Alina said, closing the remaining distance between them, I am beginning to understand that some people are worth the risk." Dante reached up, gently brushing a tear from her cheek, his touch far softer than anyone in the underworld would have believed possible from a man of his reputation. "You already know how far I am willing to go to protect what matters to me. I do not intend to let you disappear from my life, Elena. Not now, not ever. Even knowing everything this could cost you. Even knowing that caring about me makes you vulnerable in a world that punishes vulnerability without mercy. Especially knowing that," Dante said firmly, "because I have spent my entire life protecting an empire built on power and control, and none of it ever felt as important as protecting you did during this past week. I would rather face every enemy this city has to offer than go back to the emptiness I lived in before you fell asleep at that bus stop." Elena laughed softly through her tears, the sound surprising them both with its genuine warmth. "That is possibly the strangest and most wonderful thing anyone has ever said to me." "I am not known for conventional expressions of affection," Dante admitted, a rare smile touching his lips. "No," Elena agreed, smiling back at him. "But I would not want you any other way." The distance between them finally closed completely as Dante leaned down, gently pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that carried the weight of everything they had both been too afraid to acknowledge until now. It was not rushed or desperate, but careful, deliberate, filled with the quiet certainty of two people who had finally allowed themselves to want something without the fear that had governed their lives for so long. When they finally parted, Elena rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing slightly unsteadily from the moment they had just shared. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now," Dante said, "we figure this out together. No more managing everything alone. No more pretending that needing someone makes you weak. We build something new, something neither of us has ever allowed ourselves to have before." In the weeks that followed, word of the relationship between Dante Marchetti and his secretary spread quietly through the careful channels of the underworld, carrying with it a quiet recalibration of how the man himself was understood by those who had once believed his position depended entirely on remaining untouchable. Rather than viewing him as weakened by his attachment to Elena, those who understood the full story began to see him differently, as a man whose strength had only deepened, whose loyalty had proven fierce enough to reshape the balance of power in the city without hesitation. Salvatore Conti, having learned firsthand the cost of underestimating what Dante was willing to do to protect the people he cared for, maintained a careful distance from Marchetti territory, unwilling to risk another confrontation that had cost him so dearly. The uneasy peace between their organizations held, built not on mutual respect, but on a clear and unmistakable understanding of exactly what Dante was capable of when someone threatened what belonged to him. For Elena, the transformation of her life felt almost impossible to fully comprehend. The woman who had once sat alone at a rain-soaked bus stop, believing she had no one to rely on, now found herself standing firmly beside one of the most powerful men in the city, no longer carrying the weight of her struggles in isolated silence. She continued working alongside Dante, though their relationship had evolved into something far deeper than employer and employee. Together, they navigated the complicated balance between his world of calculated danger and the quiet, genuine connection they had built between them, each finding in the other a partner capable of understanding both the light and the darkness that defined their lives. On a quiet evening months later, as rain once again fell softly against the windows of Dante's penthouse, Elena stood beside him, watching the storm outside with none of the fear or exhaustion that had once defined her relationship with rainy nights. "Do you remember what you asked me that first morning after you found me at the bus stop?" she asked. "I remember," Dante said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I asked why you didn't call someone." "I think about that question often," Elena said softly, "because now I finally understand the answer. I did not call someone because I did not yet know what it felt like to have someone worth calling. Someone who would stop everything, without hesitation, simply because I needed help. Dante turned to look at her, his expression filled with a warmth that had once seemed entirely foreign to the man the underworld feared and respected in equal measure. You will never have to wonder that again. Outside, the rain continued to fall, no longer a symbol of isolation and quiet suffering, but a gentle reminder of the night everything between them had begun to change. In a world built on power, control, and the constant threat of betrayal, Dante Marchetti had found something far more valuable than any territory or fortune he had ever fought to protect. He had found someone worth building a different kind of life for, someone who had taught him that strength did not require the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to protect what mattered most, regardless of the cost. And as the underworld continued to whisper about the unexpected transformation of one of its most feared and respected figures, Dante and Alina remained exactly where they belonged, together, unshaken and finally, completely understood by the one person who mattered most.